Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third film in our series for this class. Our third film is Singing in the Rain, and it falls under the musical category. And I know some of you probably think that the musical genre is dead or dying, but I would argue that it's not. And let me give you just some examples. Films that might have been in theaters in your lifetime. So, well, Wicked was incredibly successful, so successful that there was a sequel. I didn't see the sequel, but I saw the original. But very successful film. Just in 2016, La La Land was one of the best films. Some people thought it was should have been the Best Picture winner at the Oscars. The Greatest Showman was 2017. West Side Story, the remake of the 1961 version, Spielberg made it in 2021, and it did really well at the box office. Tick Tick Boom was 2021. Dreamgirls was 2006. Chicago won Best Picture in 2002. But films like Enchanted and Hairspray, even movies like the Pitch Perfect series, have all been very, very successful at the box office. So I think all that is evidence that although there are not as many musicals being made now, the genre is still very much alive. So I don't know whether you like the genre or not. Um, I think a lot of kids start off watching them. I mean, think about films like Encanto or Moana or Frozen. Hugely successful films, and kids love them. I mean, we've probably have little siblings, or maybe you're a parent and have little kids who sing along with those films. So I remember as a kid, I grew up having musicals on. I had two older sisters, and I think we watched The Sound of Music every year during the holidays. And as a kid, The Wizard of Oz and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory are movies that I watched over and over again. And Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory has been remade twice recently. Wonka was just 2023. So but other films that I watched growing up, Fiddler on the Roof, which was 1971, The Color Purple, the original Spielberg did in 2085, but has been remade recently. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, if any of you have seen that, My Fair Lady. So those are some of the classics I grew up on, and then loved films that are kind of somewhat in the category. I love the independent film Once, which is a British film, and Pitch Perfect. And although they don't necessarily follow the traditional elements of a musical, there is a lot of singing and even dancing in them. So, anyways, it's a very popular genre, and it has been for a very long time. If you look on the 100 best musicals of all time, Singing in the Rain is almost always top of that list. First of all, it stars Gene Kelly, who was a brilliant dancer, could sing and direct. He co-directed this one. Um, and so that's a big part of it. But I love the film because it does an amazing job showing the transition from the silent film era to the talkie era. And it really does a very good job of showing that transition. A lot of the great silent actors could not make that transition. The most famous, I think, is Buster Keaton. I highly recommend that you watch some of Buster Keaton's films. My favorite is Steamboat Bill Jr., but there's so many other great ones as well. And he was the only one who really gave Charlie Chaplin a run for his money. Charlie Chaplin was the most famous actor of the time, and he was able to make the transition from silent films to talkies. But Buster Keaton really didn't. He was very small and athletic, and yet he had this kind of raspy, deep voice, and his voice didn't match his look, and so he fell out of popularity. a lot like the character um, Lena Lamont in the film. So it deals with that. By the way, there will be a question on the final exam about the jazz singer. The film deals with the jazz singer a lot. That is a real film that came out in 1927, and it started the craze for talkies. All films were silent. And in fact, they were truly silent for most people. Only in the biggest cities like San Francisco, New York, Boston, maybe LA, were there some kind of accompaniment. There was an organist or a pianist, maybe an orchestra for some of the big films premieres, but most theaters play them in complete silence. And suddenly now with this film, there was sync sound. The actors, you could hear them on screen, and it was like magic for audiences, and they loved them. And very quickly, from 1927 to 1930, movies really changed from silent era to almost all films at that point were talkies. So the film deals with that transition and deals with it in kind of a funny way. There are so many stories of how there was a learning curve. They didn't know how to record sound, and there were a lot of problems. And the film did it. I mean, that one scene when Lena Lamont is talking and she talks like this as she's going back and forth she couldn't figure out where the microphone was. At one point they put the microphone on her chest and there was the heartbeat. That actually came from this film. They had mic'd Debbie Reynolds and she was dancing, and when she stopped to do her lines, the microphone was picking up her heartbeat, and they thought that was funny and they added that to the scene. So there's some fair amount of reality in that. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Gene Kelly and Debbie Reynolds. First of all, Gene Kelly was 40 years old when the movie was being made, and Debbie Reynolds was 19. In the 50s, 1952, that was no big deal at all, but 40 and 19 seems a bit strange to me. By the way, Debbie Reynolds had never acted in a film. She had never done any singing or dancing. Gene Kelly really didn't like that she wasn't more prepared, more trained. She at the time she lived at home with her parents. She had to take 3 buses to get to the set each day. She had to wake up at 4 to get there in time. And oftentimes the working hours were 19 hours. So after a few weeks of shooting, she was just too tired, didn't want to take the time to travel back and forth. So sometimes she would sleep right on set. By the way, Gene Kelly had a reputation of being a perfectionist, which could be really good and in some ways really bad. It was funny. Donald O'Connor, who played Cosmo, said that he was a bit of a tyrant. And he said for the first couple of weeks, he was so afraid of making a mistake because Gene Kelly would, yell at, attack anyone who would make a mistake. I think this is a very interesting story. The make 'em laugh scene, which I think is amazing. I mean, Donald Connor runs up a wall and does a flip, and I had never seen anything like that before then. And very athletic scene. By the way, Donald Connor was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. That's a lot. And it was an incredibly athletic scene. But anyways, he had to do the scene over and over and over and over again, and it was really taxing. And when they finally finished the scene, he had to be hospitalized. He had burns on his arm. He was so exhausted that he was hospitalized for a week. Well, during that week, all of the footage from the scene had accidentally been destroyed. So when he got back to the set, he was notified that he had to shoot it all over again. So pretty tough. But anyways, I think the scene turned out really well. But back to Gene Kelly being a perfectionist. It was Debbie Reynolds who said the 2 toughest things in her life were making Singing in the Rain and giving birth to her child. So that's how tough this job was. In fact, the Good Morning song, you remember when the three of them were singing? At the end of the shoot for that scene, she had to be carried to her dressing room because she had burst several blood vessels in her feet. So she was incredibly exhausted from that one, and doing all these dancing. However, it makes it sound like Gene Kelly was a big jerk, and he was a perfectionist and demanded the best, but he also did himself. He not only he danced in every dance. He would dance, Debbie Reynolds danced in some of them, Donald O'Connor danced in some of them. Gene Kelly danced in everything. And the other thing that he did was not only was he directing or co-directing the film, at the end of every day of shooting, they would go to the sound stage and they would re-dance so that the um, audio guys could record all of their sounds, their footsteps and tap dancing. And Gene Kelly ended up on this film doing not only all his own sounds, but all of Debbie Reynolds and all of Donald O'Connor's tap and foot sounds. So when everyone was, when they were done shooting their scene, they would go home or relax, and Gene Kelly would go to the sound stage and do it more. And then the other thing too is the famous Singing in the Rain scene. I've got some facts I want to tell you about that. But the day they started to shoot that scene, he was sick. Gene Kelly had I think it was 103-degree temperature and was throwing up right up until they started to shoot. And yet he danced it over and over again until it was perfect. And so he pushed himself just like he pushed everyone else. And what they do is phenomenal. They're physically very impressive. So I think that the dancing is what makes this film so special. Okay, the famous Singing in the Rain scene. First of all, they did it on the studio lot. All the big studios had several city blocks of New York or Boston. They're very East Coast cities. And so they took a couple city blocks and they put black tarp over them so that they could shoot anytime during the day and it would look like night. They also piped in sprinklers that would make heavy rain on the street while he was dancing. They tested it, and they thought that it didn't look it didn't show up on film quite as well as they wanted. So they added a bunch of milk to the water. I think it was like 10% of the liquid is milk so that it would be more visible. But anyways, they were all set to shoot one afternoon. And when they were about ready to roll, they turned on the sprinklers to create the rain. And instead of a heavy downpour, it was more like a drizzle. Well, in Culver City, where the studio was, it was summer and everyone was coming home from work and turning on their sprinklers, and the water pressure went down. So they had to shoot it the next morning, and that was when Gene Kelly got sick. Anyways, that was a very famous scene, and it's considered to be one of the best dance scenes of all time. So when you talk or write your comments, I'd love to know what you think about the transition from silent films to talkies or the dancing, because Gene Kelly's considered to be one of the best of all time. Fred Astaire is another one of the great ones. By the way, a couple times Gene Kelly got a little too rough, verbally abusive with Debbie Reynolds. At one time in particular, she went back into a room and crawled underneath the piano and was crying. And Fred Astaire, who was working on the lot, happened to see her and gave her a pep talk and some dance lessons. And the best dancer. One, Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire. Who do you think are the great dancers? By the way, dancing is still very popular. Um, not that long ago, So You Think You Can Dance was a big show on television. Still to this day, Dancing with the Stars is very popular. So when it comes to dance, you could talk about that. The way the film was shot, I think, was particularly interesting, very colorful. The other thing I wanted you to think about too is my least favorite part of the film is the dream sequence. I don't really feel like it fits, but it was an opportunity to have more music and more dancing, and that's what was important to those people who love musicals. I don't love it. However, I don't know if you know this, but the woman, the one who's flipping the coin, and that is the very famous Sid Charisse. She was at the time probably the most famous female dancer in the world. She was known for her legs. If you think about the moves where she picks up his hat and lifts her leg up into the air to give it back to him, or he jumps into her arms and she's, showing off her legs. She was known for kind of perfect legs. In fact, she had $1 million insurance policy on her legs. And $1 million, that's like 100 million now. But that's how important they were to her work and um, her popularity, etc. So, anyways, the very famous Sid Charisse, they had to find a way to work her into the movie. And by the way, in 1952, many thousands of people went to see just because Sid Charisse was in it. So you might not even know who she is, but that's part of why that section is in the movie. But um, what do you think of Sid Charisse? What do you think of Donald O'Connor? The acting, the age differences. What do you think about musicals? I mentioned some that the more modern musicals that I love. Pitch Perfect cracks me up, and that's great. I liked La La Land, which seemed more like a throwback musical. But what are some of your favorites? Do you think that the genre is worthy, or do you like it? Do you think it's dying? I don't know. These are all things that you can think about, that are all things that why Singing in the Rain represents the musical genre, and why Tim and I chose it for this assignment. So, anyways, I look forward to reading your comments about the musical and musical genre and Singing in the Rain in particular. So, thanks.